Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Diane Johnson and board member of Conscious Capitalism, the Bay Area chapter. And I speak on behalf of the entire board of Conscious Capitalism Bay Area, how delighted and honored we are to have this really critical learning session, online learning experience. And just to share the background, at a board meeting, the board was brainstorming about what kind of content we wanted to share with the conscious capitalism community and other networks in context to COVID-19. And Cheryl spoke about how she was, Cheryl Leong, shared how she felt very, very called to create the opportunity to speak on and share perspectives, as well as the circumstances about how people of Asian descent and Asian Americans were being targeted in this pandemic. And so out of that brainstorm, we collaborated on this panel, and I'm delighted. So I will just serve as your host and track calls. We have so many people on the call that we're going to request that everyone stays muted, as well as if you have questions or comments, to put them in chat, and then either myself or Dr. Claudine Leong who is our facilitator, will serve as kind of the conduit to have questions to our esteemed panel. And I just want to say that this is also a reflection of one of the core tenets that we really follow here at Conscious Capitalism Bay Area, and with both not only conscious leadership and conscious culture, and the sense about how do we engage our stakeholders. And so we also really believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a essential component of our work as conscious businesses, and those who are profoundly committed to conscious purpose as well. And so welcome, everyone. And let me introduce our facilitator, who's Dr. Claudine Wu, and also known as Cici. You see her on the screen, it says Cici. And she's gonna serve as our facilitator for this evening. So Dr. Claudine, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Diane Johnson. Always a pleasure. And Diane, while you didn't mention your background, you truly are a wonderful expert in this space. And so I know we'll have you available to answer questions later. And just to get things going, I'm really excited. Again, for anyone who's just joining, please go ahead and type in where you're coming in from in the chat. And I'll just give, by way of background, that I am a scientist. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm also Chinese American, and I'm also just really passionate about conscious capitalism. So what an opportunity and an honor to be here today. And it was really thanks to Cheryl Leong through the chapter, who proposed this session, gathered up Lily Zheng, who you'll meet briefly in a moment, and also Sydney Coleman, whom I happen to overlap with. And then, not surprisingly, people know people. And so it's really wonderful to have these three experts with us today to give you a little bit more background around what each of them does. I'll just refer to my notes here. Just wanted to share that, again, this is what we'd like to do for the group, is to really share a few points that hopefully, if you are experiencing this, or if you have people in the workplace who may be experiencing anti-Asian discrimination, that you will leave with some understanding of the awareness of this topic, just what's the scope that we're seeing, and also have some ideas for your workplace. We're going to provide that through our experts. And then finally, what are some ways that you as an individual may be able to help support, or if you need support for yourself, maybe what are some resources? So that's really what we would like to get out of this. Now, if you do have any particular questions that you would like asked. You can type them in as our panelists are speaking, but also just feel free. I think at the very end, we'll have probably a robust Q&A session, so with Diane facilitating. So with that, I guess I would just like to invite Cheryl to join me in this virtual platform here. Cheryl, would you like to just say a few words about what it is that you do in your daily life, and maybe just describe for us what what were the three things that happened to you that brought this into your direct experience?
So hello everyone, welcome. And I work as a licensed psychotherapist in private practice, work with a lot of Asian and Asian American mental health. I'm also have been a leadership and organizational consultant and coach for many years now. And so was very driven to organize such a panel for both personal as well as professional reasons. I did experience firsthand some of these discriminatory things. Starting February, one incident, and then another incident in my doctor's office in the waiting room, and another one with just a series of Uber rides being canceled outside my Safeway. All these happening right around the time of sort of the start of the outbreak. And so I thought that since I was sort of personally experiencing this, I sort of imagined that it was happening on a wider scale, and true enough, over time, news from family living in Australia, family members living in the UK were sort of sharing similar experiences. And then news of various hate crimes emerged over time, and that sort of led me to think that this was a really, really important thing to do. And so that's sort of where all this started.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. I know you and I have been exchanging some notes about this, and we'll provide some of these links afterwards if people are interested. But there is actually a way to report these occurrences. And when I last checked, which was last week sometime, it was about 650 in the US. But as Cheryl mentioned, she and I both have family in Australia, and I think this has also occurred in Canada and in the UK. So it's not an isolated incident. I think we're just going to, just because of where we're all located, we'll be focusing more so on the US, but we are also aware that this is happening in other countries to people of various Asian descent. And that has to do with the way in which scientifically the community has really focused on relating to the virus as a family of viruses called coronavirus, and specifically asked that the illness or the condition that occurs with it is referred to as COVID-19. However, as many of you may be aware, there have been certain people who've insisted on referring to it from a place of origin or a country of origin, rather than as the scientific community would refer to it. So that's, I think, maybe part of the genesis of this. Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing your direct experience, and thank you also for introducing us to Lily. And I wonder, Lily, if you would like to now take a moment to describe what you do in your daily life, and also give us some background in terms of what has been a historical setting for Chinese and Chinese Americans and some other Asians in the US.
Fantastic. So hey folks, my name's Lily Zheng. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. And I've been doing this work for a number of years as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the history and the context behind what we're seeing now. As many of us have heard before, history repeats itself. And what I feel like is really important for understanding what's going on now is looking back through the last several hundred years to see how these same sorts of events have played out in different ways. So, for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take folks down just a quick history lesson, just to recap some of the major events starting from the 1800s or so. And I'm going to tie that into a narrative about discrimination and sentiment against Chinese people and against Asian people in general that helps us understand what's going on today. So we can start the story around the 1800s or so, the 1820s, when immigration started from China. Around this time, mostly men were coming to the US for opportunity and work as low-wage laborers, mostly on railroads and mines. And so almost immediately after these immigrants came in the 1800s, racial tensions began starting up. There was an outcry and a depiction of these immigrants as quote unquote like cheap Chinese labor, and fears that these immigrants would take jobs away from low-wage white workers resulted in more or less the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Yes. Basically, this act prevented Chinese people from settling in the US. It prevented the immigration, and it also stopped people inside the US from becoming citizens. And so this act was later extended by the Geary Act of 1892, and by the 1920s, similar laws were put in place to stop most people from Asia from coming into this country and naturalizing. And so this applied to Koreans, this applied to Japanese immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So during this time, the 1800s or so, racism was a commonplace occurrence in the US. There are a number of notable historical events that I want to bring up. The first is the 1871 Chinese Massacre, which was a race riot in LA, I believe, where a number of immigrants were murdered and lynched by white and mestizo residents of the city. There's the 1887 Hell's Canyon Massacre in, I want to say, Idaho, where 34 gold miners were also murdered. And the 1906 Chinatown burning in Santa Ana, which is close to Los Angeles. And so, these sorts of occurrences happened pretty frequently, where violence was directed at Chinese American communities. I want to share a quote from Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan from 1896, when he wrote about the Chinese race as, quote, "A race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. Persons belonging to it are, with few exceptions, absolutely excluded from our country. I allude to the Chinese race." So this is the backdrop, right? This is sort of the historical context at the very beginning in the 1800s leading to the 1900s of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States. Now, something interesting that I want to draw attention to is by the time we reach the 1940s, sentiments had slightly shifted. Because the US went into World War II with China on our side, quote unquote, this sentiment shifted to portray Chinese people as positive, and now Japanese people as, the enemy. So basically, you saw a shift in the way that media was talking about Chinese people and Japanese people. Suddenly, guides were coming out on how to differentiate the good, loyal Chinese from the, arrogant, conniving Japanese. Whereas years before, right, this language hadn't existed. Chinese people were discriminated against. And Chinese people continued to be discriminated against during this time. But the sentiment, right, at the time was framing Japanese people as the enemy. And as we know, this ended up resulting in the Executive Order 9066, which is Japanese American internment, one of the most egregious civil rights violations in the history of our country. Then after World War II ended, that started the Cold War. And suddenly China, right, became the enemy again. This was the start of the Cold War. This was the start of the Red Scare. And one of the historical accounts from this time, or one of the historical stories from this time, details that of a Chinese scientist named Chen Xuesen, who, I believe that name, and there are many people with that name in China, that name was found related to the Communist Party, and so this Chinese scientist was forcibly put under house arrest and later deported to China. He had no connections to China. He, barely knew people in China. He was naturalized. He had lived in the United States for a long time, and he was deported to China because he was suspected of spying. Apparently, he later went on to found the Chinese space program. So, maybe it was not the best idea to deport him. But basically, after that time, the 1960s saw the emergence of what we now call the model minority myth. It's an idea that you might have heard floating around on the internet. And it's basically a so-called positive stereotype that Asian Americans are healthier, less rebellious, smarter, harder working, and more successful than other people. So without context, this looks like a good thing. It sounds like a good thing. On its face, it's positive. But when we look at the context by which the model minority myth came about, we can see that it was created as a direct response to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And this narrative was pushed primarily by conservative white people in power to pit East Asians mostly against civil rights movement leaders. And so this myth, this model minority myth, basically became the thing that other people of color were compared to, right? People would say things like, oh, you're pushing for civil rights, like you're protesting, you're being so violent, why can't you be like those good, docile, submissive, hardworking, pull themselves up by their bootstraps Asians.
Lily, I've definitely heard that before. I've had
Yes.
people come up to me and just sort of say, like, when they were kids, their parents said, oh, why can't you be like those good Asian kids who just sit still and just do what they are told?
Right.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. And, I guess I'm just curious, when you're faced with that kind of stereotype and now we're in the workplace, does this kind of encounter, is that something where people are likely to report it? Is it something where we're even going to hear about it? Or is what's being reported just so egregious that it has to make the news? I mean, what's your assessment of
right. So
how people operate with that?
These sorts of incidents are never reported. One, because without the historical context that I've been talking about, and there's lots more, but I'm happy to cut it short here for now. Without the historical context, it seems like a positive thing, right? It seems like a so-called positive stereotype. Like, in fact, many of my friends growing up who were also East Asian or Chinese American didn't know this history, and so would use the model minority myth just as fact, right? They would be very proud of it. They would say, oh yeah, we're Asian, we're better than other people of color because we work hard and blah, blah, blah. Like they would just buy into it. So I think on its surface, there's perhaps the lack of recognition that this idea itself is harmful. And then even if there is recognition, because it's a so-called positive stereotype, people don't want to shake the boat by reporting it, right? Because this model minority myth is the means by which East Asians, mostly, can get conditional privilege, right? They can sort of get a leg up in the situation if they conform to this stereotype at the cost of other people, mostly other people of color. So plenty of people who are even aware that this is kind of a fake stereotype may actually buy into it and say, look, if I just keep my head down and act like a good Asian, then I won't get discriminated against. Other people of color will, but not me. So there are so many factors that go into this, we could have, an hours-long conversation about relations between East Asians and South Asians and Southeast Asians and people of different races and white folks and how power and privilege intersects with all of these. But I have a feeling that's a different discussion, and we should continue talking about the workplace.
No, definitely. And so just tell me a little bit about how you interface with companies. Like, how is it that your work supports and what they're asking for?
Sure. So what I typically do is I work with client companies to come up with solutions to their workplace problems around DE&I. These are typically systemic problems in their culture, with their leadership, and relating to this sort of topic, right? What people have been asking for is, what do I keep in mind? What are some tips? What are some things that I should do or not do? And this, this starts an interesting conversation because people are looking for a list of 10 words not to say and 10 words to say, and then they check the box and they're done. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, we need better solutions than that, right? Because this is such a long-seated, a deep-seated problem that's existed in our country for hundreds and hundreds of years and is a global issue, it can't just be solved by small checkbox things. And so I help companies, come up with solutions to this that actually work, that stick, that help their employees, get through this, and that minimize the discrimination that takes place.
Well, thank you so much, Lily. And I know that I love that you're recognizing that we do have this spectrum of, some people are going to start right at the very beginning. Is this even a problem? Right? And then from there, and some people will be very sophisticated in their knowledge and understand nuances, such as you were mentioning, like, different Asian backgrounds, like one is not the same as the other necessarily. And how is that addressed? So thank you for sharing and laying that historical foundation. I know we're going to get into some really good conversation. I do want to just share a little bit about Sydney Coleman. You are joining us in your personal capacity. You are a DEI expert. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, and also just what you would be sharing with us tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Lily. I'm Sydney. I work at Google. I've worked on a few different things there, a few different teams, both marketing, diversity and inclusion strategy, and most recently focusing more on product inclusion. So I'm excited to be here and be having this conversation with you all. I was just feverishly taking notes, so I've already learned so much, and I always do when I'm around Lily, which is amazing. So I'm happy to share some of my opinions and things that I'm thinking about as we sort of unpack what's happening with the virus and the subsequent social impact and xenophobia that we're experiencing and seeing. I will say that this is, like you said, my personal opinions and not in any way representing the stance that Google takes. So just put that out there as sort of a PSA.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney. And, I think part of what I'm interested in is actually, we have never been in a global pandemic like this before, and certainly, although there may have been things that were called out or people have been, let's say, where race is, front and center, or an assumption of race or ethnic origin is related to a world event or a current event. But just given that we don't see necessarily an end in sight at this moment, and I'm just going to call it out, you're the only non-Asian on this panel. So I really want to start with, what does a business solution look like, and how can it be created or implemented by somebody who isn't perhaps of that group of origin? Would you mind just maybe taking that on?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we had a conversation about this, and a comparison that I can make is how we responded to some of the shootings that were predominantly targeting groups of color, communities of color, that happened in 2019. And one of the things that I worked on at Google that I think was somewhat impactful was creating some crisis comms and a crisis response for our executives. And I think when it comes to situations of political trauma, what we're experiencing right now, and obviously the racism that is happening as well, it's really important to give people a space to feel heard. And oftentimes I think that the leadership is so distant from what people are actually experiencing in the company that it can be really challenging. Michelle Kim, who is the DE&I thought leader, who
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Before you go into that, can we just unpack that a little bit more? So what I want to understand is, what was your role specifically during this time? And because you're talking about your role as identifying and being able to create crisis communications, what was happening or not happening around this incident? So the incident took place, which was a shooting in Gilroy,
Right.
and then
Right.
what was your role and how did that kind of unfold?
Yeah, so this was specifically the shooting that happened at the Garlic Festival in Gilroy, which was actually like 45 minutes away from Google HQ. And I, as like a person in DE&I, I was working closely with our employee resource group for the Latinx community, which is called OLA. And one of the things that came up was the fact that we hadn't heard from a lot of our executives, specifically around we'd heard comms and things like that around the shooting in general, but not the fact that it was like a racially motivated event. And that left teams and individuals feeling like the leadership could potentially be apathetic to the fact that this was racially charged and an act of hate against a specific community with identities that were in particular being targeted, and also in our backyard, right? So what I worked on was I partnered with some executives in the cloud group to create comms that ultimately were sent out to about 30,000 people, just identifying sort of what the situation was and trying to express empathy, specifically identifying sort of this elephant in the room, that this is an active hate crime, this is targeting communities of color, and how like the company is taking a stance for these groups of people who are experiencing a political trauma.
Thank you, Sydney. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I just hope it's okay. I just wanted to slow that down a bit because to me, it feels very, somewhat analogous to the situation, right? While it hasn't been one sole incident that we're talking about, a mass shooting, but it's a collection of at least 650, could be more, across the US. And certainly there have been occurrences in other countries. So for a global company such as where you work now, or even potentially for a small remote company, this could be going on. And I think especially in the setting of remote work, you can't see your employees' faces every day, right? So I don't know how people are checking in. I think some companies may be connecting online, like through venues like this. Yeah, and I didn't mean to cut you off earlier. I do want you to get to mention Michelle's. Go ahead and mention Michelle's.
Yeah. I just wanted to plug. Michelle Kim has an incredible Medium post that just talking about exactly how to handle situations like this, and some of the takeaways, which she says so beautifully, are just like I had mentioned, addressing sort of the elephant in the room, and acknowledging that people are suffering. And if you say nothing, that's going to be kind of interpreted by your employees as a lack of care, apathy around what's happening. And like Lily discussed, I mean, we're seeing obviously hate crimes, disproportionate health outcomes is another thing that's really top of mind, in addition to scapegoating the Asian American community and all sorts of violence online, offline. I mean, I think people are experiencing things that are unprecedented in terms of anxiety around this issue, and also just around like their health and caretaking and financial security, and just to not hear from your leaders is going to it's a little tone deaf, and I think it's going to leave people feeling really alone. So yeah, I think you mentioned a good point. It's just like, how do you check in with people and create a safe space for them to talk about this, which is challenging obviously with remote work. But I think there's plenty of online venues, like we're using Zoom right now. It's essentially the same idea, just making sure that there's like open lines of communication. I also think that something I haven't seen companies doing a lot of, which is needed, is halting unnecessary work streams and just understanding that people have a lot of emotional labor right now. and they're caretaking, like I mentioned, their sick loved ones. I mean, this is really where allies can actually step up and take on additional work where there's bandwidth, because you know, people are impacted in all sorts of ways. And I think that expecting your employees to be working at 100% is just really silly right now. Really need to put people first. I also think that one of the things that I'm starting to look at more is, as we see companies doing layoffs, doing furloughs, you know, all of these structural inequities come out. It's important to kind of think about who's getting laid off, who's getting furloughed, who's receiving less than 100% of their paycheck, and tracking these trends to kind of understand from like a corporate perspective, like, if you're laying off all of your people of color and you're furloughing women disproportionately, or what have you, people with disabilities, like, it's important, I think, to really take a close look at what identities are represented in these populations, and that it's not, you know, perpetuating inequities that already exist. And I think, like, lastly, what companies could do is expressing that there's total, like, zero tolerance for any of this hateful rhetoric, and scapegoating or anything that's going to be damaging, which we see in society at large, but companies have the opportunity to say, like, this is unacceptable, and really put their like a firm stance on that, to make sure that people are feeling safe in the workplace, even if it is from their couch. So I think that's really important right now.
Oh, thank you, Sydney. And I'll just throw a wrinkle in there just quickly, because obviously in California, Bay Area, we have a lot of tech companies, which in some cases serve almost as media companies. And so I think there is a bit of a wrinkle there. How do you maintain your business while are there ethical standards you need to uphold around these types of topics? So I'll leave that out there. I'll let the audience consider that. Maybe you can chime in with your expertise, audience members. I want to bring it back to, so thank you, Sydney. I want to bring it back to Cheryl. Cheryl, in your work, where you're really supporting people of color in some cases, have you been asked to support your clients in any particular way around this kind of either direct hate crimes or discrimination?
Yeah, and maybe I'll answer this in a more sort of generalized way.
Of course, yeah.
And maybe just backtrack a little bit to my career. You know, I was also managing the SARS outbreak in 2003. And a lot of the same sort of xenophobia and racism was there. In fact, I'm going to quote Margaret Cho. She says, you know, SARS is code for severe Asian racist syndrome. You know, it was there. You know, she was in Toronto and she saw it. There was an outbreak there too. And, you know, I was working with some frontline customer service people at the time, and they were, these Asian staff were experiencing it firsthand on an international level. And it's interesting because it was oftentimes combined with sexual harassment, which is, and it's also sort of, you know, can get more complex as we get sort of more deep into thinking about these things. I'll talk about just this thing from sort of a wider kind of angle viewpoint. I think if anybody identifies as Asian, right, and say you've experienced some kind of violence around this, racist violence around this, verbal abuse, you know, or you, on a secondary trauma level, you've heard stories about this from friends and family, or you're seeing this in the media, and you're experiencing some level of emotional distress, right? Or you're having trouble sleeping because of this, or you feel more depressed, you're hypervigilant when you leave the house, you're not sure, you're kind of looking around for danger. I want to say that these are completely human experiences. These are normal, valid human responses to racist experiences. And I'm seeing this on a community mental health level. Like, you know, this is a human thing. And I know it's always sort of a little sort of touchy for me, because I recognize that as a clinician, I do have this power of diagnosis and psychological labels, and I never want to do that with any particular group or anything. The last thing I want to do is label, you know, any community. But you know, let's destigmatize mental health here altogether and say that if you're experiencing any of these things out there, this is valid, this is normal, and it's human. You know, psychologists have, over the last 10 years or so, you know, talked about this as race-based stress or race-based trauma. And again, I think giving things a label sort of gives us a little more power to talk about what's happening to us. Sadly, a lot of data shows that Asians oftentimes are the last ones to get mental health help, especially cis men. Tend to be the last ones to get help. And so there are sort of many obstacles in the way of getting support here. You know, I think as a community, we're going to be experiencing these things on varying levels. Anything from, you know, just extreme hypervigilance and you know, traumatic experiences to, you know, some of us may not experience any of these things at all. But you know, I just want everybody to know that there are professionals out there who can be there for you. I think in sort of being sort of there for organizations over the years, I've oftentimes reminded people that your employee assistance programs, your wellness programs at work, right? Employee wellness programs, they've got to be culturally competent. You know, if there are Asian employees, if there are people of color in your workplace, these programs have to reflect that diversity. So I think that's sort of where I sort of want to go with this a little bit. Did you have another question for me?
Oh, Cheryl, thank you so much. It's really great. And I do want to let our audience know that we have some additional resources available for you. I was able to connect with Dr. Valerie Jackson of UCSF, and she's made us aware of a series of, actually, one is already passed, but there's one, and I'll share this out broadly, but it's coping with xenophobia, and it's actually a series of 6 workshops. These are really geared towards individuals, and it's also it's sponsored through San Mateo County Health, and they're providing information in Chinese as well as other tips. So I just really appreciate, Cheryl, that you're inviting anyone who's maybe in the HR space or leadership space able to, or frankly, anyone working anywhere, to really ask these questions. Is our EAP culturally competent? Is this something that, you know, because usually first check is, okay, do we have a program? Wow, if we have one, that's great. Your call out to destigmatize mental health, like, let's just face it, everybody, global pandemic equals stress, mental health challenge for everyone on this planet at this moment. So, you know, we can always take a deep breath, but also just know a lot of what we're experiencing is a collective grief, you know, a collective grief around the world that is no longer here. And if there's anything in addition that's going on directly to you or someone that you love or care about, work with, want to support, then that's an additional layer. So I appreciate you, Cheryl, for just kind of helping us to really put some words to it and think about it in that way. And I'm wondering, Lily, since you also work with companies, you know, is there anything in particular that you'd either guide people at companies to look into, like if they have existing programs, or what are some steps? Like, let's say somebody has nothing, where do they start? And if they do have something, where do they go from there?
So the first thing that I'd ask is, who is the someone? Mm-hmm. And I ask that because I think the people with the most pressure on them and the most potential to do good in the situation is actually managers. You know, people in positions of power where they can create norms and expectations on their teams. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution right now, especially because while we're all grieving and while we're all having, you know, a tough time, we're not all necessarily dealing with it in the same way. And I think this goes back to what Cheryl was talking about race-based trauma, right? We're seeing, you know, people's coping with COVID-19 falling on pretty well-treaded lines of racial difference and racial tension, right? So we're seeing the inequalities in, for example, the healthcare system, right, impact Black communities differently. We're seeing the discrimination in the hiring process against queer and trans people, hitting queer and trans people extra hard right now, especially queer and trans people of color. And with regards to Asians and Asian American people, right, we're seeing the same sorts of responses today that we've been seeing in the last so years. So I think not only should we push for managers and workplaces to have access to culturally competent care, we should be making sure that managers of teams are culturally competent themselves in the way that they're interacting with their employees, the ways that they're interacting with their team. That is absolutely crucial, because I think right now we don't just need managers who can say things are tough for everyone, I hear you. We need managers who can accurately assess the situation and say, you know, we're experiencing really strong emotional contagion effects right now where people are stressed out, but let's say, you know, each time a hate crime is reported, the Asian American employees on your team are probably going to be more stressed out about that than, let's say, the white employees. We actually see a very similar pattern around things like the murders of trans people or police brutality, right? All of these things are events that impact different members of different communities differently. And understanding that that's very much the case and keeping on top of the news and keeping on top of, you know, how people are feeling in the media that we're consuming is absolutely essential for leaders and managers to understand what their workplaces need right now. So, you know, that's I think a very general level suggestion that I would give. In terms of the resources that I can recommend, there have already been some great things shared. I will also, you know, second Michelle Kim's work. She's incredible. She's written a lot about this. She recently was on a Zoom webinar about this. It was excellent. But I think really knowing how your team is dealing with it, and more broadly how your company is dealing with it, should drive which resources you end up seeking out.
Well, thank you, Lily. So really what I'm hearing is just asking the question, you know, how are your employees doing? Asking the question, what is my company response to this, if anything, will get you somewhere more
Right.
than today, because people, you know, if there is something, at least acknowledgement and resources and
Right.
some level of evaluation, depending on what people need.
But make sure you have a hunch first, right? So don't simply just put it out there and say, how are you feeling about everything? Say, we recognize that like racial tensions exist right now. We recognize that, you know, members of certain racial groups might be feeling more threatened, more under attack, right? We recognize that Asian Americans are experiencing increased hate crimes, right? How are you feeling? Because if you don't say that, right, then your employees won't know that it's safe to actually share it, right? There's so many situations that I've been in with clients that I've talked to who say, you know, we ask, but our employees tell us nothing. And I talk to the employees and say, of course I tell them nothing, right? Like Frank is the most racially clueless person I've ever talked to. Like I say something and I'll get retaliated against immediately. Why would I say anything? And so, you know, we need to make sure that leaders know this and that they get educated and they learn about these things so that they can put it out there that the company cares, that the leader themselves cares, that they are ready to hold space for people to be feeling these uncomfortable emotions around these historical traumas.
Thank you, Lily. I'm seeing some good sharing in the chat, so keep that up. I love that, you know, those of you who've come in here for today. I want to make sure that we save time to get to your questions. I do want to turn back to Sydney and just ask, could you speak a little bit about maybe how allyship could look in this situation? You know, not everyone is going to have that direct experience or be part of this group. So what is it that that you can offer by way of either your direct experience as an ally or what you've seen done with companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it comes to allyship, a lot of times people focus on their individual actions and not being racist. And it really needs to go much further than that. You need to actively be anti-racist. And so what that looks like is standing up to people that you encounter, maybe colleagues, people that you love in your life, and really standing up to racism and confronting it head on. So if you know, sounds like everyone in this group, if you believe in racial justice, if you believe in equity, then you don't want to be the person that's silently reinforcing or benefiting from the system of racism. So you need to actually take some action and speak up. And in doing that, I think it's important to note that like you're going to experience discomfort, you're going to be afraid, it's going to be awkward, you're going to put your foot in your mouth, but you need to actually like do the work and educate yourself and unburden people of color in particular right now by taking on that workload of educating yourself, learning what's happening, and confronting the issue head on, and really using your voice and using your privilege, because that's what it comes down to. When you're fighting like systems of oppression, you have to be comfortable not speaking for, but confronting oppression head on, and using your voice to sort of identify what these issues are and address them. And then there's this kind of fine line. Of course, you don't want to be a white savior. So I want to just call out that it's really important to actually listen to people of color and take on the riskier work where you can, and use your privilege in that way. But obviously giving credit, giving support, like I think right now it's a really important time where we can support small businesses who are owned by people of color. I think that's like a really small but easy way to have an impact in your personal life. And just really like acknowledging when you have made a mistake, but continuing to come back and like step into it, because that's ultimately how you can use your power and your privilege in a relevant way and really combat this rhetoric and combat the hate that we're seeing all over the place.
Thank you, Sydney. Yeah, and I'd love to invite Diane, Dr. Diane Johnson, to weigh in on this as well. As, I mean, you're certainly very well versed in this. Now we're talking about Asians and Asian Americans being affected. What's your viewpoint on this as maybe representing another group, and how you could serve as an ally in this situation?
Okay, well, I'm gonna not serve as a representative of another group.
Okay.
I think that's actually what often happens, and that's like, I'm not going to do that. But let me just share and just give some context, because I'm CEO and founder of MAPU Management Consulting, which is a national consultancy that works on a lot of organizational culture and DE&I. And one of the things that strikes me about this conversation, and that's really critical, is that we actually, and I so appreciate Lily and Cheryl's perspective, because I think what we hoped was to speak specifically of the experience of people of Asian descent and Asian Americans. And so I think it's very, really important, and as Lily's comments really referred to, is the uniqueness, the unique experience of those who are of that awful term, the model minority, right? And I think this is particularly challenging in particular industries, especially we're in the Bay Area, so especially in tech, where you have a significant number of people from that ethnic group. And so the assumption is, oh, well, you folks, there's so many of you, we don't have to, that management feels that they don't have to consider the profound, the unique experiences of people of Asian and Asian American descent, right? And that also is related to that, and there are so many people who are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work on this call, so I'm just gonna share a BFO, a blinding flash of the obvious, that we understand that our responses, that anyone's individual response has to go beyond the individual. Because as long as we conceptualize racism as an individual problem, like what an individual can do, and not look at the structures and systems within a company and organization, as well as, and the concentric circles, from individual to team to company to region, etc. It is, I think it's so challenging to really address the challenges. So it's that we have to address individual situations, but we have to understand where is how our particular systems and structures unconsciously targeting and making assumptions about people from any ethnicity, but specifically in context of this, and why this is, I think, why the challenge of the context of COVID-19 is that it is, we've got people who have phenomenal power who are consistently targeting targeting China, targeting people of Asian descent, that it provides permission for individuals and organizations to continuing perpetuating ethnic-based prejudice. Right.
Oh, thank you, Diane. Thanks for calling that out.
And
what did you call it? A BFO? Was that, is that
yeah,
what you said?
blind flash of the obvious. And my question specifically to Lily is, what experiences or I don't want to say training, but what learning or pathways of learning have you observed are most impactful in managers understand, like, coming out of that dominant culture and that kind of assumptive mindset?
Okay, so there's actually quite a bit of research on this. Basically, what works, in short. I would direct all people on this call to check out Dobbins and Kalev. That's Dobbins and Kalev. They write a lot on DE&I. They most recently published something in the Harvard Business Review, I believe, like yesterday. Basically, the things that work are programs and workshops and trainings that approach people from the dominant or majority group, white men managers typically, from a place that recognizes that they're going to be part of the solution, and that doesn't make them feel defensive. So this is a very complex conversation. I personally, feel kind of weird about the fact that we need to tiptoe around their feelings and emotions, but there is very, very well documented research that shows strong backlash effects when we try to basically propose diversity training from a remedial perspective, right? There's heaps and heaps of research that shows that when we frame these sorts of conversations as, Jim, you have a problem, and Jim, we need to make you less racist, the only thing that's going to happen is Jim is going to get more racist. So the unfortunate finding of many decades of research is that we need a different approach to this work that engages these men in positions of power, these white men in position of power, and sometimes white women too, as folks that are going to be part of the solution. There are some things that are shown to work really well. One of them is train the trainer trainings. So these are trainings that aim to build competence in participants to train people themselves. So usually what happens when you teach train the trainer trainings is the participants become really vocal supporters of whatever it is you are teaching, right? So teaching white men, for example, to advocate on behalf of people of color, right, does a really good job of helping these men feel like they're important, they're involved, and getting them to change their attitudes. One other approach which research shows favorably is bystander intervention research, basically training men to be part of the solution so that when they see something, they say something. These two are, there's one more. Task forces. Apparently companies with task forces, right, like do really, really well in actually getting the buy-in of white men leaders. So I would say that these three tips are some of the most useful that I found in my experience that work. I also want to put on the table that it's not always comfortable to do this kind of work, right? Like there's a part of me, and it's the part of me that comes from the activist background that says, like, why should I like cater to majority groups' feelings? Why can't they just teach themselves? And one thing that I'll put out there is that it isn't everyone's job to teach everyone, right? So keep in mind that as a practitioner, right, or as someone that cares deeply about D&I, you are going to have your own niche where you can make the most impact. It may not be this one, right? It can be another one. So keep in touch with all the folks in your network that are doing this work so that all of the important work gets done. That's just something I'm going to say to folks on the call.
Lily, we've got a question from the audience, and Diane, I know you usually moderate, but Shelley's asking, can you speak more on task forces?
Task forces, yeah. So basically, task forces work because they get leadership buy-in from the very top, and that is one of the things that research again has supported. When you get executives and or board members invested in an initiative, they feel more intrinsic pressure to ensure its success. Right, so this is also basically tied to research showing that if you want your diversity initiative to succeed, get an executive sponsor, right? Get someone involved, make sure that they have a stake in it. Task forces, I think, get a bad rap sometimes because they can be perceived as delaying the problem, right? Oh, we're gonna convene a task force and we'll get back to you in 6 to 12 months. But it's really heartening for me to see that the research shows that task forces do in fact lead to positive changes. I can dig up the research later and link it with the resources. But it's interesting. I personally didn't actually think they were as effective as I found out that they were. So that's something that I learned recently.
And another question follow-up, can you just describe an example of what the bystander and intervention, what that looks like? Or
yes, so bystander intervention, for example, let's have a scenario set up where you're hanging out with your close friend who's a colleague of yours at a bar after work, and he says like, oh man, it's wild that there's that Kung flu going around, or I don't know, some similarly racist thing. And then you can say, oh, let's just use Jim again because I don't like Jim today. Wow, Jim, you know, like yeah, things are certainly really tough right now, right? Like I'm interested in hearing why you said that, or why you're calling that, because you know that seems kind of problematic to say, and I didn't take you for the kind of person that would say something like that. Like, can you tell me more? So it's using your friendship with this person to identify that what they did or said is kind of breaking a social norm, and say like, yeah, you know, scientists are recommending that we call it COVID-19 because, you know, there's the really real chance that if you're using terms like that, even if you mean it positively, it ends up having a really negative racist influence. And I know you're not a racist, Jem. Like, I know you care a lot about the people you work with. So, you know, I just want to put that, you know, on your radar so that you don't say that in front of your team members, because I think that could really negatively impact how your team interacts with you. Right, so I just made that all up, right? But I think that's one example of an interaction that could go well from a standpoint of a bystander, right? And the beauty of this is the speaker in this situation would also ideally, right, be one of Jim's friends and share the same identities as Jim, maybe a white man. It wouldn't work if I said this, right? Because more likely than not, Jim would get defensive and say, oh, I'm not being racist towards you, right? Like, oh, I didn't mean it like that. But because, you know, bystanders share those same identities and have the trust of the folks that they work with, right, oftentimes that can be more effective in terms of allyship and getting folks to change their behavior. Just an example. You're muted, Cici.
Okay, here we go. Thanks, Lily. Really appreciate that. Cheryl, I know you were getting a question from Diane to see if you could share some of your best practices. I'm going to invite the audience because I think you've, collectively, you have a great wealth of information as well. So please feel free to just either put in questions for our panelists now. I'm going to try to get to a lightning round of like, what are the kind of last things that anyone wants to leave you with. But since we're getting some questions now, I just want to see if Cheryl wants to address this one about sharing best practices.
I think it's the sort of coaching and consulting I do around these sorts of things are more emotional, intelligence-based type of stuff. And I think around conversations, anytime you talk about race, anytime there's a diversity or inclusion conversation that comes up, one of the most difficult things that happens in the workplace is that your heart rate goes up almost immediately. And your central nervous system is aroused almost immediately because we're human. And these conversations actually touch on some of the oldest kind of evolutionary parts of our brains. And so kind of witnessing and noticing how your heart rate is through these types of conversations, breathing deeply so that you can start to regulate your central nervous system is so important. It's so important, especially if you want to listen to a coworker tell you about something that's happened to them, or if they're sharing that the atmosphere feels racist or xenophobic. Listen, take a little, inventory of how your heart rate is going, especially if you think it's gone over 100 beats per minute. There's no chance that you're going to be listening with any empathy or any sort of presence. So breathe, bring your heart rate down, do what you need to return to listening. The second piece is just the skill of emotional validation during these types of conversations. So often we end up minimizing, discounting, gaslighting, telling people, no, it wasn't really racist. Why did you think that was racist? Or, are you being oversensitive? And that's adding salt to injury, right? So the skill of validation is just an incredible one to have. It's not just listening deeply. It's also, flexing your empathy muscle, and at the same time validating and normalizing and helping this person feel heard, and honoring what they're sharing with you as their truth and their reality, and you're there for them. These are the two sort of basic skills that I usually sort of help coach managers through thinking about race-based conversations. So that's just.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Cheryl. Really, the taking a deep breath, as you were saying, can just help to calm and settle. I've also seen studies where just the amount of, Tylenol that people might be taking to try to quell pain from like a strenuous workout, that can actually also interfere with the ability to experience empathy. So there's subtleties there, but I think that, taking 3 deep breaths even, or get to 10, can just really shift things and then have that conversation. I also know, like, asking people, are you ready to hear this? That can help to, like, if you're going to share something with a person, asking them, are you ready to receive this, can also help to make sure that it's a meaningful exchange. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I know we're pretty close to the end of our time. I just want to see, are there questions, Diane, that we have? And yeah, we thank Sydney for joining us today. She wasn't feeling well. So getting a question about what is the best way to support an Asian person who feels confronted or attacked at work? So Lily, do you want to take this first, and then Cheryl jump in?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that this is something that happens while they're at work, right? So there's some incident which occurs. I would make sure that the very first step is to check in with them to make sure that they are, dealing with the situation as well as they can. If you are perhaps there in the exact moment that something happens, right? Make sure that you prioritize the well-being of the person that is experiencing the thing. After the moment has passed, I would have a conversation with them. If they want to have a conversation with you, keep in mind that, like, you might not be the first person they turn to, and that's okay, as long as they have some help or some support. If you do end up being that person, you can basically have a conversation about what they need and what they want in the situation. Never presume to know what someone who's gone through, like a racist incident will want. So they might, for example, want to immediately go to a manager, or to immediately report it, or to go to their ombuds or HR or whatever their workplace has to report the incident. They might also not want to talk about it. They might want to deal with it on their own, to just forget about it, or they might want to confide in you personally. So make sure that you ask, that you don't make assumptions, And then if they do, right, ask for something or frame a desire to do something that you can help with, right? Let's say they say like, oh, you know, I want to talk to someone about this, but I don't know what to do. Then you can, you know, put yourself into the conversation and say, can I help? Here's some things that I can do. I know the person who, you know, you would need to report this to, or I've had some familiarity with this process myself. Then you can start offering help. So, you know, only at this time should you do that. If you lead with, oh, wow, I just saw that awful racist thing which happened. Like, I know the person that processes, you know, these sort of discrimination claims. Let's do that right now, right? That's more likely than not to put the person, you know, off, to make them feel pressured, to make them feel worse. So make sure you go through these steps of making sure that you're checking in with them and asking them what their needs are.
Cheryl, do you want to weigh in on this piece? We have another question, and then we're going to wrap up in like 2 minutes. So, Cheryl, did you want to weigh in on this piece? Because we have one more question coming in.
I think Lily just covered everything.
Okay.
The next question, yeah.
Fantastic. So, getting in a question about if the perception is that there are Asians at work who seem to really just be, quote unquote, keeping their heads down, to, you know, really just living in that model minority role and not necessarily outwardly acknowledging this kind of stress or tension. Is there any way to bring it out? Like, hey, you look Asian. Are you stressed about this situation? What exactly? I didn't. That's not the question from the person, but I'm just asking, trying to convey that question. So I don't know, Lily, do you want to take it on, or?
I'll take a quick stab at this.
Sure, thanks.
So if you're not Asian, there's not much you can do, unfortunately. If you are Asian, or at the very least, you're good friends with someone who is Asian, you can float the possibility of someone from, you know, a similar group or similar background as them having this conversation with maybe some of the historical context which we've been talking about today. I think it's very important to meet people where they're at, and also, right, help people understand what's happening today in light of, you know, some of the history we've been talking about. Like, I've only had good experiences talking to Asian American people about our history because so many of us don't know it, right? So many of us actually believe in the model minority myth, and like really had no idea that like our communities have gone through so much in this country and that our ancestors have gone through so much in this country. So it's often very helpful to have that conversation. Again, not everyone can have that conversation, right? If I don't know, like a white person that knew a lot about Asian American history tried to educate me, I'd probably get really, really upset. So, you know, no offense to whoever knows a lot about that, right? It's just not something that I would be ready to hear. So if you're not Asian, work with someone who is, work with a leader in your workplace, and try to have them, you know, breach that conversation to start saying like, hey, you know, as an Asian person, right, like our communities are going through a lot right now. We should have a conversation about this. And if you're not Asian, be okay with the fact that you might not be included in that conversation, right? That's that's one of the things about, you know, being an ally, recognizing that it's your job to create an impact. It's not your job to make it always about you. So recognize that good impact can at times not involve you at all.
No, thank you, Lily. And I'm gonna throw this out just as like how complex things can be, right? Like this is all occurring because people look a certain way, right? And there's a running joke in my family. My husband was born in Hong Kong, but in fact, he is of European descent ancestry. So I look Chinese, he doesn't, but he's the one that speaks Cantonese and I don't. So, you know, whatever that means in terms of identity, he can explain what living in Hong Kong means because he's lived there and he's grown up with that culture, but I can't, but he looks white. So I think this is a very like complex thing. That's a rare occasion, but in any case, I appreciate everyone's expertise in this. I hope that we've provided some guidance, and also want to turn this back over to Diane to help wrap things up for the evening.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their participation. I want to especially thank this really insightful panel. Thank you, Lily and Cici and Cheryl, and also to Sydney, who had to get off because she isn't feeling well. And I just want to make the observation that this is the most diverse participation in a session that we've had at Conscious Capitalism, and it speaks to what I think the board knows, and is that when we create content that speaks to people, they show up. So and just to let folks know that we are recording this, and this will be up not only on our website, but it will be available to Conscious Capitalism chapters all around the country, if not all around the world. And so I'm really heartened by this conversation, and that this is also representative that every other month we have content that is focused on DEI. So for those folks who, if this is their first time joining us, I really invite you to come again, and also to participate in either the East Bay chapter or any of the chapters that we have in the Bay Area, or actually Conscious Capitalism chapters around the country and around the world. And I just want to again thank everyone for their participation, for their great questions, and for just showing up. And with that, we will say, stay safe, stay healthy, practice self-care, and also the connections that we're able to use via, technology helps us to stay connected and to continue learning and sharing all of our wisdom.
Mm-hmm. And all the panelists are open to connecting through LinkedIn as well. Thank you to the audience members, and we look forward to seeing you on a future call. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.